In 2012, a man jumped from a capsule nearly 24 miles above the Earth. For more than 4 minutes, he fell through the atmosphere. There was no aircraft around him, no runway below, just a human being, a pressure suit, and the planet spinning beneath him. When Felix Baumgartner finally opened his parachute, millions of people were watching. And across the footage, one name appeared again and again: Red Bull. At first, it looked like another extreme sports stunt. But Red Bull wasn't simply sponsoring the jump. It had created the event. It had built the media around it. And it had turned a can of energy drink into the symbol attached to one of the most extraordinary human feats ever broadcast. That raises a strange question. How did a drink that didn't even exist as a category in most of the Western world become a global business, capable of putting a man at the edge of space? The answer begins thousands of miles away from Austria. And it begins with a drink that looked nothing like the Red Bull we know today. Because before Red Bull had wings, it had a red gower. 1. The drink before Red Bull. In Thailand during the 1970s, Chaleo Uvidya was building a pharmaceutical business. He understood something about the market that many Western companies had overlooked. Workers didn't always need another soft drink. They needed something functional, something they could drink while working long hours, driving trucks, or fighting fatigue. In 1976, Chaleo introduced a beverage called Krating Daeng. The name roughly translates to red gower, referring to the powerful wild bovine native to Southeast Asia. The drink was sweet, concentrated, and non-carbonated. Its audience wasn't wealthy European executives. It was workers. And that distinction matters, because Krating Daeng was already solving a problem. People were tired. They wanted energy. And Chaleo had created a product around that need. But the drink was still primarily a Thai success. It wasn't a global phenomenon. It wasn't sold in a silver can. There was no famous slogan. And there was certainly no international sports empire surrounding it. Then, in the early 1980s, an Austrian marketing executive arrived in Thailand. His name was Dietrich Mateschitz. Mateschitz was working for the German consumer goods company Blendax, and his job involved traveling internationally. During a trip to Asia, he encountered Krating Daeng. He tried it, and he became convinced that the drink could have a future outside Thailand. The problem was obvious. What worked in Thailand wouldn't necessarily work in Europe. The taste was different. The format was different. And, most importantly, Western consumers didn't think of energy drinks as a category. So Mateschitz faced a choice. Forget the idea, or build a market that didn't exist yet. He chose the second option. 2. Inventing a market. In 1984, Mateschitz and Chaleo formed Red Bull GmbH. Each invested roughly $500,000. The ownership was divided between them, with Chaleo's son Chalerm holding the remaining 2%. But the arrangement contained an important distinction. Mateschitz would run the company. Chaleo had the drink. Mateschitz believed he knew how to sell it. That combination would become the foundation of Red Bull. But there was still one enormous problem. Nobody knew whether Europeans wanted the product. So the drink was adapted. The Thai formula was modified for Western tastes, including carbonation and changes to its sweetness. The packaging was transformed. The name became Red Bull, and the two charging animals remained central to the visual identity. But changing the product wasn't enough. Mateschitz had to convince people that the product was necessary. That was much harder, because if you asked someone in Austria in the mid-1980s what an energy drink was, there was no obvious answer. The category barely existed. Red Bull wasn't competing inside an established market. It was trying to persuade people that the market should exist. And that is a very different business problem. A company entering a crowded market can ask, how do we beat our competitors? Red Bull had to ask, how do we make people understand what we're selling? So Mateschitz did something that would eventually become the company's defining strategy. He stopped treating Red Bull like a conventional beverage. He started treating it like an identity. 3. The can becomes a symbol. Red Bull launched in Austria on April 1st, 1987. That date would eventually become famous inside the company. But the launch itself wasn't guaranteed to succeed. There was no established energy drink aisle waiting for Red Bull. No cultural expectation that people should drink a small can of caffeinated liquid before a long night. No obvious reason why someone should pay a premium for it. So Red Bull created reasons. It targeted people who were already living the kind of lifestyle the brand wanted to represent. Students, nightlife, young professionals, athletes, people who stayed awake longer, people who pushed harder, people who wanted something more intense. And instead of relying only on traditional advertising, Red Bull put the product directly into those environments. That strategy would evolve into one of the company's most recognizable marketing systems. The brand didn't simply tell consumers what Red Bull was. It tried to make consumers experience what Red Bull represented. Energy, speed, risk, performance, adventure. The slogan eventually captured the concept in 3 words. Red Bull gives you wings. The phrase sounded like advertising, but it was actually a positioning strategy. Red Bull wasn't trying to sell a beverage as much as it was selling a transformation. You aren't buying caffeine. You're buying the feeling that you can do more. And once the company understood that, its marketing strategy became increasingly unusual. Because the product didn't have to be the center of the story. The person using it could be. Do 4. The problem with success. But creating demand created a new problem. If Red Bull became associated with a specific lifestyle, the company had to keep producing experiences that justified that association. That meant advertising alone wasn't enough. A commercial could show someone performing an incredible stunt, but eventually the audience would ask, can Red Bull actually be part of this world? So the company began investing heavily in sports. Not just the sports with the largest television audiences. The sports that fit the brand. Motorsports, skateboarding, snowboarding, surfing, mountain biking, freestyle motocross, cliff diving, air sports, and eventually almost anything involving extraordinary physical or technical performance. This was a crucial shift. A normal beverage company might sponsor a sport to put its logo in front of viewers. Red Bull increasingly wanted to become part of the sport itself. That distinction would change everything, because sponsorship gives a company access to someone else's audience. Ownership gives the company control over the story, and Red Bull was beginning to discover the power of control. 5. America. By the mid-1990s, Red Bull was moving into one of the most important markets on Earth, the United States. Red Bull's American launch came in 1996, 9 years after the original Austrian launch. But America was not simply another country to add to a distribution map. It was a test. If Red Bull could become culturally relevant in the United States, the company's potential could expand dramatically. And the strategy was unconventional. Red Bull's marketing relied heavily on sampling, local activity, and people who could introduce the product directly to their communities. The company's student marketeer program would eventually become a major part of this approach, using university students as local ambassadors to create awareness, trial, and visibility on campuses. The logic was simple. Don't wait for consumers to discover the brand. Put the brand where the consumers already are. But there was something even more important happening. Red Bull was learning that distribution and marketing could reinforce each other. If people saw the drink at parties, they wanted it at stores. If they saw it with athletes, it became associated with performance. If they saw it in nightlife, it became associated with staying awake. If they saw it around young entrepreneurs and students, it became associated with ambition. The product was accumulating meanings, and those meanings were becoming more valuable than the liquid inside the can. That was the real breakthrough. Red Bull wasn't simply creating consumers. It was creating a world for consumers to enter. 6. The world of Red Bull. This is where the story changes. Because eventually, Red Bull began producing things that had almost nothing to do with beverages. It created events, it funded athletes, it produced films, it developed media, It entered football. It entered motorsport. It created competitions. It built platforms around music, gaming, dance, and culture. Red Bull's own media operation became part of the strategy. The company could now film the athletes it sponsored, tell their stories, distribute the footage, and place the Red Bull name inside the content. That created a remarkable loop. The company sponsored the athlete. The athlete created an event. The event created footage. The footage created an audience. The audience strengthened the brand. And the stronger brand helped sell the original product. The can financed the world. The world sold the can. That was the engine. And it was unlike the traditional advertising model. Coca-Cola could buy a commercial during a major sporting event. Red Bull increasingly wanted to make the sporting event itself. This strategy also solved another problem. Advertising has a shelf life. A television commercial runs for 30 seconds. A remarkable event can become a story people remember for years. A famous athlete can become part of the company's identity. A historic sporting moment can be replayed thousands of times. And suddenly, marketing wasn't just promotion. Marketing was becoming intellectual property. Today, Formula One. Then Red Bull entered a world where money, technology, and prestige collided. Formula One. Red Bull had already been involved in motorsport sponsorship before owning a team. But in 2004, Mateschitz made a much larger commitment. He bought Jaguar Racing from Ford. The team would become Red Bull Racing and enter the 2005 season. At first, the reaction was not exactly reverence. Red Bull was known for marketing. The Formula One establishment knew about engineering. And the new team developed a reputation for being something of a party team. But Mateschitz wasn't satisfied with merely being visible. He wanted to win. So Red Bull began assembling serious technical and racing talent. Christian Horner became team principal. And then came one of the most important hires in the company's history, Adrian Newey. Newey was already regarded as one of Formula One's great technical designers. His arrival changed the perception of Red Bull. The company that had entered Formula One looking like a marketing experiment was now building a serious racing organization. The problem had changed. Red Bull no longer needed attention. It needed credibility. And credibility would have to be earned on the track. In 2005, Red Bull's first season produced a promising 7th-place finish in the Constructors' Championship. In 2006, David Coulthard delivered the team's first podium. Then came 2009. Sebastian Vettel won Red Bull's first Formula One race. And suddenly the marketing machine had something much more powerful than advertising. It had proof. Red Bull could say it was about performance. Now it could point to a Formula One victory. But that was only the beginning. In 2010, Vettel became world champion. Red Bull won the Constructors' Championship. And over the next 3 seasons, the team and Vettel would dominate Formula One, taking 4 consecutive drivers' championships from 2010 through 2013. The company had transformed itself again. A beverage brand had become a racing power. And once Red Bull understood that it could own the machinery behind the spectacle, another idea became possible. Why stop at one team? Lee 8. Building the system. Red Bull bought Minardi in 2005. The team became Toro Rosso, Italian for Red Bull. The purpose went beyond simply putting another car on the grid. It created a development pathway. Young drivers could enter the Red Bull system, prove themselves, and potentially move toward the senior team. The company now had a pipeline. Talent could be identified, developed, tested, promoted, and eventually turned into stars. That system produced drivers such as Sebastian Vettel and later Max Verstappen. The model was becoming familiar. Red Bull didn't just sponsor talent. It tried to own the environment in which talent developed. And this reveals something important about the company's broader strategy. Red Bull repeatedly moved one step closer to the thing it wanted. First, it sponsored. Then it organized. Then it produced. Then it owned. The progression was almost invisible while it was happening. But taken together, it was creating something far larger than an energy drink company. 9. the moment that changed everything. Then came October 14th, 2012. A capsule rose into the stratosphere carrying Felix Baumgartner. The project was called Red Bull Stratos. The objective was extraordinary. Baumgartner would ascend to roughly 39 kilometers above Earth and attempt a free fall from the edge of space. And millions of people watched. When Baumgartner stepped out, the Red Bull logo wasn't appearing beside the story. The Red Bull logo was part of the story. This was the difference between sponsoring an event and creating one. The company had turned marketing into a global media event. And the symbolism was almost perfect. The product promised wings. The company had built an event about a human being falling through the sky, but there was a deeper business lesson. Red Bull had discovered that the most powerful advertisement might be something people actually wanted to watch. Not because they wanted to buy an energy drink, but because they wanted to know what happened next. Would he survive? Would the equipment work? Would the conditions cooperate? Would the jump succeed? The product didn't need to interrupt the story. The brand had become the story. That is an enormous transformation for a beverage company, and it explains why Red Bull's marketing can look so different from traditional consumer advertising. The company isn't always trying to convince you to buy a can. Sometimes it is trying to give you a reason to remember the name. Lax can, the second great problem, but success creates its own danger. Once a company becomes associated with extreme performance, ordinary marketing can start to look ordinary. If the last event was extraordinary, the next one has to compete with it. If one athlete breaks a record, another athlete has to push farther. If one event becomes global, the next event has to become even more compelling. This creates a permanent escalation. Higher, faster, farther, more dangerous, more technically difficult, more spectacular. And that is where Red Bull's strategy becomes both brilliant and difficult. The company has built a brand around possibility, but possibility has no obvious ceiling. There is always another mountain, another race, another jump, another record, another person willing to attempt something that sounds impossible. Red Bull therefore turned escalation into part of its identity, and that identity spread beyond extreme sports. 11. Football, media, and the empire. Red Bull entered football in a much more direct way. It became involved with clubs, including Red Bull Salzburg and RB Leipzig. The philosophy was familiar. Don't simply place the logo somewhere. Build the platform, develop the talent, control the infrastructure, create a recognizable identity, and connect different parts of the organization. The same philosophy appeared in media. Red Bull built a world of content around athletes, sports, music, culture, and adventure. It created documentaries and event programming. It developed its own channels and platforms. The company became something strange. Part beverage company, part sports organization, part media company, part advertising agency, part talent development system, and part entertainment brand. That sounds like a collection of unrelated businesses. But from Red Bull's perspective, they were connected. Every part reinforced the same central idea: energy, performance, adventure. Possibility. The company had taken a physical product and built an entire mythology around it. 1. 12. The ownership story most people miss. There is another part of Red Bull's history that is easy to overlook. For decades, the public face of the company was Dietrich Mateschitz. He was the Austrian businessman who turned the product into an international phenomenon. But Red Bull was never simply the story of one man. Its origins remained tied to the Uvidya family in Thailand. Chileo supplied the original formula and became Mateschitz's partner. The ownership structure at the company's founding gave each of the two founders 49%, with Chileo's son Chalerm holding the remaining 2%. That meant the Thai side retained a majority stake. Mateschitz, however, ran the global business and became its public architect. It was an unusual partnership. One side brought the original product, the other brought international marketing and expansion. Neither alone created modern Red Bull. The global empire emerged from the combination. And that is one of the biggest misconceptions in the story. Red Bull was not invented in an Austrian laboratory. Its roots were Asian. The man who helped turn it into a global brand was Austrian, and the company became enormous because those two histories were combined. 13. The second generation. In 2012, Chelio Uvidea died. 10 years later, in 2022, Dietrich Mateschitz died at the age of 78. For a company so closely associated with its founder, that could have been a moment of uncertainty. Would the philosophy survive? Would Red Bull become a conventional beverage company? Would the empire be sold? Would the brand lose the unusual personality that had defined it? Instead, the basic system continued. The company remained privately controlled. The sports organizations continued. The media operation continued. Formula One continued. And Red Bull remained focused on the same fundamental proposition it had been building for decades. Give people wings. But there was another twist. By now, the original product category had become enormous. The company had helped create the market it entered, and competitors had followed. Energy drinks were no longer an obscure concept from Asia. They had become a permanent part of American and global beverage culture. Red Bull had solved its original problem. People now understood what an energy drink was. But solving that problem created a much larger one. How do you remain distinctive when everyone knows the category? Red Bull's answer was to make the brand bigger than the category. 114. The can becomes the smallest part of the business. Look at Red Bull today, and the contradiction becomes obvious. The company's most famous product is tiny. A can, a few inches tall. But around that can exists an enormous ecosystem. Athletes, teams, events, films, music, gaming, football clubs, Formula One, extreme sports, media, and thousands of stories built around people doing things that most people cannot do. The can is the physical product. The world surrounding it is the emotional product. That may be the most important lesson in Red Bull's history. The company didn't win simply because its drink was different. It won because the meaning attached to the drink was different. Caffeine can be copied. Sugar can be copied. Packaging can be copied. Even a slogan can be copied. But an entire cultural world is much harder to reproduce. And Red Bull kept expanding that world. 15. The global scale. By the end of 2025, Red Bull said it was selling in 178 countries. The company reported 13.969 billion cans sold worldwide in that year alone. It reported group turnover of 12.196 billion euros and more than 21,900 employees. Those numbers are remarkable, but they aren't the most interesting part of the story, because Red Bull began with a product category that barely existed in Europe, a drink from Thailand, a partnership between two entrepreneurs, a small company in Austria, and a marketing gamble that had to convince people to buy something they didn't know they needed. The company didn't simply enter a market. It helped define one. Then it used that market to finance something much larger. And that larger system helped sell the original product. The loop had closed. 116. The hidden business model. So what actually made Red Bull so powerful? It wasn't just caffeine. It wasn't Formula One. It wasn't extreme sports. It wasn't clever advertising. It was the connection between all of them. Red Bull created a problem. People were tired. It created a response, an energy drink. The response created a new problem. How do you make people care about a beverage category nobody understands? The company responded with lifestyle marketing. That created another problem. How do you keep that lifestyle interesting? Red Bull responded by investing in sports. That created another problem. How do you stand out among sports sponsors? Red Bull responded by owning teams and creating events. That created another problem. How do you keep the audience engaged? Red Bull responded by becoming a media company. And suddenly the original beverage was sitting at the center of a machine that could generate its own stories. That is the real Red Bull business model. Problem, response, new problem, bigger response. The company didn't escape problems. It used them as reasons to expand. 17. The reversal. And this is where the story finally reverses. At the beginning, Red Bull needed advertising because nobody knew what an energy drink was. Today, advertising is almost the least interesting thing Red Bull owns. The company once needed people to notice the can. Now people recognize the brand before they see the product. It once needed athletes to give the brand credibility. Now Red Bull can create the event those athletes compete in. It once sponsored sports. Now it owns teams. It once bought media exposure. Now it creates content. It once had to enter an existing culture. Now it can help create one. The beverage became the gateway. The brand became the empire. And that is why the story of Red Bull is not really a story about an energy drink. It's a story about turning marketing into infrastructure. Climax. The man who jumped from the sky. Go back to that capsule in 2012. Felix Baumgartner stands at the edge of space. The world watches. Then he steps forward. For several minutes, he is no longer just an athlete. He is the center of a global story. And somewhere in that story is a tiny can. A product that began decades earlier as a Thai drink for workers. A product adapted by an Austrian marketer. A product that entered a country where the category barely existed. A product that built its identity around people who wanted to go faster, higher, and farther. Eventually, Red Bull didn't need to advertise the idea of wings. It built a company around proving the idea. That is the contradiction at the heart of its history. Red Bull looks like a beverage company that became successful because it had extraordinary marketing. But the deeper story is almost the opposite. The marketing became so successful that the beverage company had to grow around it. The can created the brand. The brand created the audience. The audience created demand for bigger stories. The bigger stories created sports teams, events, media, and entertainment. And all of those things eventually pointed back to the can. A tiny product sitting at the center of a global machine. Red Bull really sold. In 1987, Red Bull launched a drink in Austria. There was no established energy drink culture waiting for it. There was no guarantee that consumers would like it. There was no obvious reason why people would pay a premium for it. And there was certainly no reason to believe that the company would one day operate across nearly 200 countries and sell billions of cans every year. But Mateschitz understood something. People don't always buy products because of what they contain. Sometimes they buy what those products represent. Red Bull represented energy, then speed, then youth, then ambition, then risk, then performance, then possibility, and eventually something even bigger. The idea that ordinary human limits could be pushed. That idea could be attached to a student pulling an all-nighter, a driver taking a corner at 200 miles an hour, a snowboarder launching into the air, a footballer filling a stadium, or a man stepping out of a capsule nearly 24 miles above Earth. The can didn't change. The meaning did. And that may be the greatest trick Red Bull ever pulled. It took something people could drink in a few minutes and turned it into a world people could spend years watching. Today, the company says it sold 13.969 billion cans in 2025. But the real achievement isn't the number of cans. It's that when people see the two Red Bulls charging toward each other, they don't just think about a drink. They think about flying. And that is how an energy drink became a global empire. Not by selling more aggressively, but by making the world around the product impossible to ignore. So here's the question. What was the most important turning point in Red Bull's rise? The Thai drink, Mateschitz's marketing strategy, Formula One, or the decision to become a media and sports company? Because whichever one you choose may reveal what Red Bull was really selling all along.